The reason I'm making this video tonight, it's just a quick video. There's been a number of, shall we say, misconceptions over the last number of weeks with regards to the People's Action on Section 30. And I just want to clear these up, specifically with regards to terminology. Now, you've heard me, or you've seen me, talk about the parties involved. You have ourselves, you have the Advocate General, you have the Lord Advocate, and you have the Scottish Ministers. So I'll start in reverse. The Scottish Ministers, that is to say, the Scottish Government, that is Nicola Sturgeon and her Cabinet at Holyrood. You have the Lord Advocate, and the Lord Advocate is the most senior legal advisor in Scotland. He is in charge of the COPFS, the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Office service in Scotland. He is the highest member of the COPFS in terms of prosecutions. But at the same time, he's also the highest law officer for an advisor to the Scottish Parliament. And by proxy, he is also a Scottish minister. That means that he is a member of the Scottish Cabinet, as well as also representing the Scottish Parliament. Then you have the Advocate General. The Advocate General is from Westminster. He is the highest law officer in Scotland that represents and advises the Westminster government on law to do with Scotland. So you have the Advocate General, who represents Westminster. You have the Lord Advocate, who represents Holyrood, the Parliament, and is also a Scottish minister. And you have the Scottish ministers, who are the Scottish government. Now, that is really important to know the difference between these three roles. And the reason for it is quite simple. When we sent the summons in, we summoned three parties: the Advocate General, aka the UK government, the Lord Advocate, aka on behalf of the Scottish Parliament, and separately the Scottish ministers. And the reason we did that is because the Lord Advocate, it's a conflict for him to represent both the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish government at the same time. That's why we summoned all three parties. UK government, the Lord Advocate effectively of part of the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish ministers separately. The Scottish government decided that they wanted the Scottish Government Legal Director and the Lord Advocate to represent both the second and third defenders, that is, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. It was a Scottish Government decision to do that. It was not the UK Government. It was the Scottish Government's decision to allow itself to be represented by the Scottish Government Legal Directorate and the Lord Advocate. I'm making that clear now because that is really serious to know. Okay? The first thing that happened in this case was that the Scottish ministers, that is, the Scottish Government, tried to apply for a 3-month delay, and that 3-month delay was cited as because of coronavirus. We argued that the period immediately after that would have been roughly about 3 months anyway, a period called the adjustment period, where everybody gets together their arguments. They respond to them, who then respond to them, who then respond to them, and that comes together in what's called the open record. Then we submit that to the court, and it becomes the closed record. So the time limit would have been 3 months anyway before it would have seen the inside of a courtroom. So we said, no, we don't agree to a 3-month delay, which is perfectly reasonable. The court agreed with us. They found in our favour, and so the adjustment period began. The next thing that the Scottish Government did was that they tried to sneak in a delay via the back door by putting forward a motion. Now, there are two different types of ways that you can raise a case. There is ordinary cause and there is judicial review. What the Scottish Government attempted to do was to transfer it from the method we are using to judicial review for the purposes of having it kicked out. It was a simple tactic, but simply arguing that was to delay the case anyway, which ironically comes to a delay roughly the same amount of time as the one they'd previously applied to the court for, but had been kicked out, and the court had sided with us and said no. We actually wrote the words, "We consider this to be an abuse of the court process." This was the Scottish Government. Now, the reason I can talk to you about this is because the record was leaked by either the Scottish Government or the Lord Advocate or the UK Government. We're not sure which one, and it was reported in the press. You'll all remember the reports about a statement that was made that said it is not for the pursuer, that is to say us, to stand in the shoes of parliamentarians. That statement was made by the Lord Advocate on behalf of the Lord Advocate and the Scottish Government. It was not the UK Government. So what then happened was the motion that they brought forward that we consider an abusive process, we got to the last day that we had to respond to it, to oppose it, and suddenly the Scottish Government dropped it, decided they weren't going to go ahead with it. But then they turned around and said, yeah, but he says to them, well, you'll have to pay costs for that because we had to still draft our opposition. We drafted it right up to the last day. And they turned around and went, well, no, we never filed it, so you'll just have to assume your own costs. The court didn't agree with that, ultimately. So that was a second attempt to either delay it or have it transferred to another mode in order to have it kicked out. And this was the Scottish Government and the Lord Advocate. Of course, when the statement about it is not for the pursuer to step into the shoes of the it's not for the pursuer to step into the shoes of parliamentarians, when the Scottish Government realised that was coming out, that's when they decided that they were going to withdraw. Boom! And out they came. What then happened was, because we had a closed record, which is a closed record, by the way, is effectively a big bundle, and it has paragraph 1 of our argument, and then it has the responses from the first defender, then the second defender, then the third defender. Then it has our second paragraph of our arguments, and their response, and their response, and their response. Is effectively a big bundle in a perfect order that can be given to all the parties in the case, including the judges, so everybody knows where everybody stands, and everybody is reading the same hymn sheet. It's simple as that. That's what it is. So when Aidan stands up and starts to argue in court, he can say, at page 14, paragraph B, everybody in the room knows where to turn. It's called the closed record. When the Scottish Government withdrew, because the closed record had defences for the Advocate General on behalf of the UK, the Lord Advocate on behalf of Parliament, and the Scottish ministers, second and third, we had to remove every single response by the Scottish Government from that record. But you can't just remove a response from the ministers. You then have to go back and modify your responses that were for their responses and their responses for your responses, and vice versa. So it's a big process. And guess what? That caused a month's delay. In the last hearing, which was quite a few people tuned in for, we found that although the Scottish Government had withdrawn, the Lord Advocate, who is supposed to represent the Scottish Parliament, and remember he's also a Scottish minister, was advancing arguments on behalf of the Scottish Government alongside the Scottish Parliament. Now, the separation of powers are there for a reason. Parliament is separate from government for a very good reason, because things that Parliament do don't necessarily reflect government, and vice versa. So the legal counsel, if that legal counsel is operating for both, there's a conflict of interest there. The law, in this case, the Lord Advocate somehow seems to be trying to advance matters on behalf of the Scottish Government, despite the fact that the Scottish Government have withdrawn from the process. There's only one reason for this, That is if you happen to be a Scottish minister that wants your arguments advanced, but you don't want to be seen to be the one making those arguments. In other words, the Lord Advocate has doused himself in Scottish ministerial coconut and is trying to pass himself off as a snowball, as a Scottish Parliament snowball rather than a Scottish Government snowball. Whether this was simply down to a case of they allowed the Lord Advocate to exercise his own authority and go ahead with the arguments as he saw fit, and didn't realise to the last minute, oh my God, these are the sort of arguments that there's no way a political party should ever put out there because we'll get eaten for lunch by our own members, and panicked and left proceedings at that point, or whether they actually gave those instructions, we don't know. What we do know is the Scottish Government has withdrawn, but the Lord Advocate stays in, supposedly representing the Scottish Parliament. What we also know is that he is taking instructions from the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. In fact, in the upcoming hearing, from what we can see, 3 of the 4 legal counsel that are actually arguing in the next hearing are actually from the Scottish Government Legal Directorate, not from the Lord Advocate's office. Because apparently the Lord Advocate doesn't have a legal personality of his own up here, despite being in charge of the entire COPFS. So, what we have is a situation whereby it seems that the Scottish Government have deliberately tried to slow the process down, cost us as much money as possible, drag it out, cause this delay, cause this problem, and then when it was to come out in the press about some of the statements that were made, suddenly they dropped out. That dropout, of course, caused further delays again. So that's where we find ourselves. But our hearing next week on the 4th will be going ahead, and there will be a lot of interesting arguments. Of course, when the closed record eventually becomes public, which it will after that hearing, you'll all get to see exactly the arguments that are laid out. But I thought it was important to clarify the different terminology for you folks. Okay, thanks. Good night.